you feel, I mean, you've used the phrase, Neil, thank you, always a pleasure to see you. You've used the phrase crisis of confidence amongst armed policing. We'll get on to that. But you do subscribe to the idea that the system as it stands before yesterday's announcement on anonymity wasn't working as well as it could.
Yeah, good morning, James. Thank you for inviting me on. I watched this unfold from the moment the shooting happened to the charging decisions to the trial with an incredibly heavy heart because I've been here before. So when I was head of armed policing in 2014, after the public inquiry into the shooting of Azelle Rodney, and then preparing for the inquest into the shooting of Mark Duggan, we've seen all of this before. And my view is we'll keep seeing this unless we treat this, government, all the agencies involved, the police and the public, as a watershed moment. And why do I say that? I mean, this case is layer on layer of tragedy. So it doesn't matter who Chris Kaba was. His family didn't choose to be put in this position, and they are angry, frustrated, grieving, bereaved, very difficult to think rationally at this point. And most importantly, along with a lot of their family, friends, and supporters in the black community, do not trust policing at all. And what they will think is that when someone loses their life at the hands of the state, particularly at the hands of the police, their presumption will be that the police have done something unlawful or have committed murder. And I've seen that and investigated that many times in my career. The second tragedy is that, along with their lack of confidence in the police and the criminal justice system, our armed police colleagues, who do the hardest job in policing and do it more professionally than any other jurisdiction in the world, and I've worked with almost every other liberal democratic institution around the world, also lack faith in the very system that is designed to hold them to account. And those two things are a huge tragedy and undermine our safety as citizens. So we have to think we need our armed police to have confidence in the system that holds them to account. They're not asking, and there's been a lot of talk about them being asking to be dealt with somehow differently from a normal member of the public. Before they're ever allowed to pick up a weapon, they sit in a classroom and they learn the law. And part of that law is exactly what they can and can't do. And most importantly, their personal individual accountability for pulling that trigger. And every year in the United Kingdom, thousands of those operations take place. And every year, if the trigger is pulled more than 4 or 5 times, it's an unusual year.
Yes.
So in the year that Chris Kaba was shot, there were 18,500 firearms operations in the United Kingdom. The trigger was pulled, I think, 4 or 5 times. We've got to remember that and put that in perspective when we're talking about what happened. And the other tragedy is, of course, both of them will be waiting to go through a coronial process. Both the family and the family of the armed officer will be waiting to go through 2 more processes, a coronial process and an understanding of whether he's going to be charged with gross misconduct. So I'd like people to understand why the black community feels the way they do and the need for policing to build trust and confidence so they don't feel that way when these things happen, and the way the armed officer is feeling, because look behind the badge. These are human beings who are put themselves in extraordinary situations on our behalf and have to pay a very heavy price.
And thank you for that. And what then would you see as relatively straightforward ways to improve the situation?
Well,
let's focus on the police officer. Let's focus on, because I think as things stand, he had to go to trial effectively. It would have been very difficult for some of the reasons you've alluded to. And the CPS makes its decision. There's a lot of moving parts. And anonymity has been introduced into the equation, of course, in the last 24 hours. But I think you believe that as with pursuit drivers, as with sometimes police officers, if they are doing their job, then they shouldn't be running the risk of prosecution.
Yes, and I think that's correct. And when you said that he had to go to trial, that I could debate that with you. So one of the practical measures that's taken place, and this is about treating police officers the same as a normal member of the public, is when the IOPC are investigating this, and I'm a very experienced detective and investigator, they're the only people who know all of the evidence in the case when they decide to put it before the Crown Prosecution Service. I know the unit within the Crown Prosecution Service because it deals with serious crime and counter-terrorism. It's full of the best lawyers in the CPS, generally making good decisions. But there is an argument that the threshold test for sending what looks like an investigation into an event to the Crown Prosecution Service is set at a much lower level for police officers acting in the line of duty. Now, I understand why the public might think, well, police officers have to be held to a much higher standard than the rest of us. I happen to agree with that. They absolutely should. But when they are acting in accordance with their training, their direction, their experience, and they are not deliberately departing from their training or tactics, they are not effectively acting unlawfully, then a decision to prosecute someone in those circumstances is questionable in my view.
Yes, I understand why. Is that threshold that you refer to as being perhaps worryingly low, is that a formalised criteria, or is that just human agency? It is a formalised criteria. So
it has become formalised, but it's a policy decision. It's not a legal decision.
But under that policy decision, the trial became inevitable, in a sense.
Well, potentially. I mean, I wasn't in the room.
Okay, I get that. But the other bit is how do you prove that you have only been following your training? If you discharge your weapon and if somebody dies as a consequence, who decides whether or not the training has been completely adhered to?
That's the whole purpose of a post-incident investigation when a state takes a life. So the investigators gather all of the evidence, they put it before lawyers. Lawyers decide whether or not an unlawful act has taken place. And in gathering that evidence, you would look at the tactics, how the tactics were executed. Unfortunate word, I'm sorry. But how the actual operation took place. You would be looking for witnesses, you'd be looking for CCTV, and in this case, we actually have body-worn cameras. So police officers, again, trying to be as accountable as possible to the public and as open as possible, armed officers wearing cameras during you will look at all of that and you'll put that before a lawyer and a lawyer will make the decision. But there is a tremendous amount of politicization and media pressure. Not just that, those of us who bear the scars of multiple riots in our history where an event has triggered tremendous community tension, there will be a tremendous amount of pressure on the decision makers who are there as safeguards for us as the public, safeguards for the police, in terms of making decisions, the independent bodies of the police watchdog, the independence of the Crown Prosecution Service. They are there to make objective decisions, not work under the pressure of media and politics. But that does happen.
Easier said than done. I just want to pin down who would do that, who would decide whether the officer has adhered to their training, because you've described the process that we've gone through in the Chris Kaba killing, and this is, in your view, suboptimal. So is there a new body that would make that calculation on the relationship between action and training?
No, well, in my service, I've worked with 3 iterations of the police watchdog, and on every single occasion there have been elements within that organisation who've been excellent and elements that have been poor.
Oh, okay.
No one benefits more from a professional, well-resourced, highly experienced, brilliant investigation into their actions than the police. Independently done. So that's what needs to happen. It's the senior investigating officer of the police watchdog who can make those decisions. And in fact, I heard the Home Secretary in the House yesterday, her usual very balanced and professional view, putting some clear practical measures in place, which will hopefully make this a much easier process for armed officers, much easier for policing in general, and much easier for the public to understand why these things should happen. And you started this with anonymity.
Yes.
That is probably the most contentious of those issues.
Do you welcome it?
I do, and I was if I was still the commander of armed policing in 2022 when this happened, I would have been making a strenuous case for anonymity. I mean, so I've worked in the arena that we're talking about here. I worked as a homicide investigator at the SIO for a murder squad in Operation Trident, when we worked with the black community alongside them, trying to arrest very dangerous armed criminals. And during that time, my teams, and in fact my lawyers prosecuting people for murder, received death threats.
Yes.
It is not common, but it is by no means rare for police officers and lawyers prosecuting to receive threats. When you're dealing with high-end violent crime, both in the organised crime space and counterterrorism, that is going to happen. And I have the utmost respect for the judge who made the decision not to give this police officer anonymity. I've worked with that judge. I know who he is. He has very high values and very high integrity, but I think it was the wrong decision. And I think it's the wrong decision because he made it on the basis that when he was making the decision, there was no imminent threat to the police officer. So the police could not provide an actual threat at that time. The minute you name that police officer,
everything changes.
That threat will crystallize. So it's a ridiculous catch-22.
It seems to be, and you reminded us at the outset that police officers are human beings too. There are fathers and daughters and sons and sisters beneath the uniform, inside the uniform. We forget sometimes that judges are too. I mean, people make decisions. Fallible human beings make decisions, as you've stressed, with the best of intentions and with the most integrity, but they can just get stuff wrong. I won't detain you for much longer because I'm late for the news.
I think you got it right by the letter of the law.
Yes, precisely.
Wrong by what was right.
Yeah, I do. I didn't realise we were going to do philosophy today, Neil, but it's always welcome. So I think you then leave yourself open to the accusation, for want of a better word, that you don't think it's possible for a murder to take place if training is adhered to.
It wouldn't be murder.
No.
If you look at the definition of murder,
it would be lawful killing.
It would be a lawful killing. What you'd be looking at as an investigator is whether there was any recklessness or gross negligence in the active action of the officer, and that would be manslaughter if it was proven, but it wouldn't be murder. And you have to look at the definition of murder to understand why.
And I think the jury asked very early in this case to have the definition of unlawful killing clarified, and some of the expert opinion is that the acquittal became more or less inevitable at that point, 2 or 3 days into the trial. But I digress. I just want to do one more thing, because when you were talking about death threats there, my mind ran to some of the lawyers who work in the field of immigration law, actually, and some of the targets that have been painted on their back by very prominent politicians, up to and including former Home Secretaries. Is there not a danger that anonymity now, once it's in the open, it can extend to non-firearm cases? It can extend to lots of other areas of policing. I know I'm talking about the law, but just would anonymity not also apply potentially in other areas?
You have to look at the risk assessment and the threat. Yeah. And armed policing is a very unique position to put yourself in terms of reprisal and threat. But can I leave you with the thought that actually the Home Secretary did address yesterday, but there were a lot of Black and Asian MPs in that room. Very few people in the House that day, disappointingly.
Yes, I noticed.
Most all of them supporting the bravery of policing. That was good to see. But I'm also unique in that, I was a firearms commander, but I was also the most senior officer of colour in the country. So strangely enough, I can see it from both sides. Yeah. Just like Dal Babu, my ex-colleague and friend who does a lot of media commentary. We have an unusual perspective. And what the Home Secretary was also saying is policing also has a responsibility not to have treated the Black community in the way it has done for decades, to the point where they do not trust the system or the actions. And when we're a long way away from that. And she was talking about challenging policing to understand, the race action plan, the plans that they brought about to improve Black confidence in policing and the criminal justice system. I hope she's going to make sure that is inspected carefully for every chief constable in this country. And that also has to happen.
Yeah, and some of what you've alluded to there is why we're so grateful for your time and attention today, because as you say, that dual perspective is close to unique. How's the book coming along?
Oh, it's finished.
Is it all done and dusted?
Yeah, it'll be published in April next year.
Well, you must come in and talk to us when that happens.
Well, I'd be delighted to do that. Thank you for the offer.
I look forward to it. Neil Basu, thank you very much, as always, for your insights. A former Assistant Commissioner in the BAT, in charge of armed police response, and as you just heard, very almost uniquely qualified to knit together the two elements of this conversation that we began on Tuesday morning by describing as it being possible for two things to be true at the same time. The police service can have a long and ugly record of racism, and the killing of Chris Kaba can have absolutely nothing to do with it. It's extraordinary how many people are upset by that simple observation, but I guess that's the nature of simple observations sometimes, isn't it?